Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time to a place you've probably never imagined before, a medieval tavern. Forget about polished countertops and fancy lighting. This isn't your modern bar. It's loud, smoky, and if you're not careful, you might find yourself in the middle of a heated argument, or even worse, a brawl. You push open the heavy wooden door, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, the air is thick with the smell of burning wood and the distinct scent of damp stone. Candles flicker weakly on tables, their flames fighting against the smoke curling up from the hearth in the corner. The murmur of voices fills the room, low and constant like a never-ending buzz. You look around and see the rugged faces of farmers, merchants, and soldiers. No one's trying to impress anyone here. Everyone's just trying to get through another day in a world that doesn't care about comfort or luxury. The low hum of conversations is punctuated by the occasional loud laugh or shout, followed by the clinking of wooden mugs. The people here, no matter their rank, share one thing in common. They're all here for one reason: to drink. Some might be seeking a temporary escape from the daily grind, others might be looking to strike a deal, and some are just here to celebrate or drown their sorrows depending on the day. It's a world of simple pleasures, but with its own set of rules. It's not glamorous, but it's real. A medieval tavern was a place where you could find more than just food and drink. It was a social hub, a place for exchange of stories, of ideas, of rumours, and sometimes of political power. The tavern could be a place to escape your troubles, but also a place where you might find your troubles waiting for you, in the form of a fight, a thief, or the authorities. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and the local time in the comments. I'd love to know where you're joining me from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you make your way into the tavern, you quickly realize it's not just a place for drinking, it's where people lived. A farmer might spend the day working in the fields, but come evening, he heads to the tavern for companionship, to share stories, and maybe, if he's lucky, to strike a deal with a traveling merchant. A knight might stop by after a long ride, looking for news of the kingdom or an ally for a political cause. Even the local clergy might sneak in, hoping to find out what's really going on in the town. It was a place where the walls between classes could, at least temporarily, disappear, but the reality of a medieval tavern wasn't all about cozy nights of socializing. While you could find good conversation, you'd also find the occasional brawl breaking out right next to you. Taverns were at times dangerous places, fights over spilled drinks, a sharp word, or a slight that could escalate into full-blown violence. But strangely, this was part of the charm of the medieval tavern. There was no police force to step in, no security cameras or bouncers to maintain order. Instead, the tavern keeper, who was often a former soldier or someone with an eye for keeping things under control, would step in when things got out of hand. A quick threat, a raised voice, or sometimes just a coin tossed on the counter to settle the dispute, but there were no guarantees. Sometimes the tavern itself could become the battlefield. People didn't just go there to drink, they went there to make their mark, to prove themselves, or sometimes just to get caught up in the heat of the moment. And yet, despite the rough edges, the tavern was a hub for social life in the medieval world. Think about it. These establishments were often the only places in a town where people could come together, forget about the grind of life, and be themselves, no matter their social class. But that doesn't mean it was all carefree. There were real consequences to the tavern's social dynamics, from feuds between townsfolk to the long-lasting impact of rumours and gossip. These places weren't just about sharing a drink, they were about sharing everything else, too. Remember, this isn't just a pub, this is where news spread faster than wildfire. Information, whether it was the latest royal decree, local gossip, or a tale of some far-off land, was exchanged over mugs of ale and mead, and it wasn't always a pleasant affair. Historians still argue whether taverns acted as a breeding ground for rebellion and unrest, or whether they were simply harmless places for people to let off steam. Either way, the tavern was the social network of the medieval world. And then there's the drink itself, the heart of the tavern experience. In today's world, you might find yourself ordering a craft beer or a glass of wine, but back then it was a whole different ballgame. The drink was more than just a means of relaxation, it was a necessity. Alcohol was consumed in large quantities not just for enjoyment, but because it was safer than the water available. Water sources were often contaminated, and drinking alcohol was a way of ensuring your health. Ale, mead and wine, these were the drinks that sustained people in more ways than one. You probably won't survive this, not without a good understanding of the tavern's role in medieval life. So as we get comfortable in our seats, keep in mind this isn't just about stories of drunken nights. It's about how these places shaped society. They were the beating heart of the community, the place where everything, from politics to romance to scandal, was in the mix. Whether you were the town blacksmith or a passing noble, the tavern was where you came to experience the pulse of the world. Now that you've had a moment to settle into the tavern, let's take a look at the main reason everyone is here, drinking. But it's not just about tipping back a pint and calling it a night. No, taverns were social environments, each drink serving more than just a means of intoxication. When you entered a medieval tavern, you were walking into a world of conversation, rivalry, and community. It wasn't just about the ale in your hand, it was about the people you were sharing it with and the role the tavern played in their lives. You've probably heard that the tavern was a place for common folk to unwind, but it wasn't just the peasants who frequented these establishments. In fact, some of the most important business of the time was transacted in these very spaces. If you were a merchant, a soldier, or even a noble, the tavern was the place to rub elbows with others in your field, seek gossip from travellers, and, if you were lucky, even strike a deal or two. But here's the kicker. No matter your social class, once you were inside, you were all equals. The tavern had this strange ability to blur the lines between the peasantry and the elite. You might be sitting next to a local farmer and a visiting knight, and no one would bat an eye. Sure, your food might be different, but you'd share the same mug of ale. This egalitarian nature of taverns wasn't accidental. In medieval Europe, the tavern was a necessary part of daily life, almost like an extension of the village square. People came here to find out the latest news, to negotiate, to gossip, and even to settle disputes. The tavern wasn't just a place to drink, it was the center of social life. People knew that if you wanted to understand the pulse of the village or town, you had to get yourself to the local tavern. This was the equivalent of today's social media, minus the keyboards and screens. But let's not get ahead or F ourselves, because while the tavern was a place of community, it also had its darker side. You see, alcohol was the social glue, but it could also become a dangerous weapon. And here's where things get a little spicy. Taverns were notorious for their rowdy and sometimes violent atmosphere. After a few rounds of ale or mead, it wasn't uncommon for things to get out of hand. A minor disagreement could quickly escalate into a full-on brawl. And these weren't just petty squabbles. The violence in taverns could be brutal. And the consequences, well, they were rarely severe enough to deter people from starting a fight in the first place. Why? Because medieval laws around tavern violence were, let's say, a little lenient. If the tavern keeper didn't intervene, there wasn't much the local authorities could do. Historians still argue whether this violence was a necessary outlet for the frustrations of the common folk, or if it was simply an inevitable byproduct of too much alcohol and too little supervision. One thing's for sure, though, when you walked into a medieval tavern, you didn't just have to worry about the drink, you had to watch your back too. What did these brawls look like? Well, imagine this. You've just cracked open a mug of ale and the conversation turns to something as innocent as the price of grain. The next thing you know, someone's shouting, fists are flying, and before you can take another sip, you're ducking under a swinging arm. It wasn't just the tavern patrons that could get involved either. The tavern keeper often had to step in, sometimes using a heavy hand to stop the chaos. But not every brawl was squashed quickly. Sometimes they escalated into street fights that spilled out of the tavern and into the alleyways. The tavern might have been the centre of social activity, but it was also a battleground for power, respect, and rivalry. But let's be honest, not all tavern visits ended in violence. In fact, many were much more sedate, just a group of friends or even strangers chatting over a few pints. This was a time before modern entertainment, after all. There were no televisions or streaming services to distract you. The tavern itself was the show. Picture it. After a long day of hard work, you walk into the tavern, tired but ready to relax. You order your drink, sit back and let the atmosphere wash over you. Maybe a bard will start playing a song or a local storyteller will take the stage. Taverns were places for laughter and light-hearted conversation, just as much as they were places for conflict. Of course, let's not forget that the very drink in your hand, whether it was ale, mead or wine, played a crucial role in all of this. Alcohol wasn't just about getting tipsy, it was about the social experience, and in the medieval world, drinking was a deeply ingrained part of daily life. If you think about it, every major event or celebration was accompanied by a drink, from weddings to festivals to simple gatherings at the local tavern. So, while taverns may have had their darker side, he also provided an opportunity for people to bond, laugh, and share stories. Historians argue that the prevalence of drinking in taverns was not just a reflection of societal norms, but also an indicator of how people coped with the stresses of the time. Without the distractions of modern technology, the tavern became the place where people could forget about the hardships of life, even if it was just for a few hours. It was here that friendships were formed, business deals struck, and love stories began. The tavern wasn't just a place to drink, it was where life happened. But the drinking wasn't without its consequences. You could drink away your problems, but you could also drink yourself into trouble. It wasn't uncommon for people to overindulge and make bad decisions in the heat of the moment. And when alcohol was the central element of the experience, those bad decisions could sometimes be irreversible. Whether it was a lost temper, a misstep in business, or a social faux pas, drinking in the tavern could change the course of a person's life. The tension between camaraderie and chaos, friendship and violence, this was the dual nature of the medieval tavern. It was a place where society came together, but also where it could fall apart. It was both a sanctuary and a battleground, but for those who could navigate its unpredictable nature, the tavern was where life happened, and that life was worth living. As you sip your drink and take in the lively scene, you might notice something else about the tavern. The clear lines between the social classes are blurred. You might be sitting shoulder to shoulder with someone whose life is worlds apart from yours, but here, in this dimly lit space, you're equals. That's right, the medieval tavern wasn't just a place where everyone drank together. It was a place where social hierarchies didn't matter as much as they did outside. But don't be fooled, the class structure of medieval society was alive and well, and the tavern was no exception. However, in this particular setting, these lines could often become much more fluid. A nobleman might find himself in the same tavern as a peasant, and while they may have different drink options or social status, they could share the same table and converse as equals. The reason? Alcohol had a funny way of uniting people in ways that social rank couldn't easily disrupt. At first glance, it seems a bit strange that the aristocracy and common folk could mingle so easily in a tavern, but think about it. Medieval society was tough. Nobles had to deal with political matters, endless obligations, and the constant stress of keeping up appearances. The common folk, on the other hand, had to contend with back-breaking labour, harsh living conditions, and the ever-present threat of disease or war. So both groups found something of value in each other's company. For the nobleman, it was an escape from the rigid rules of the court, and for the common man, it was a chance to rub elbows with someone who had a bit more power, or at least someone who could share a drink with him. The drinks served in the tavern didn't necessarily discriminate by class either. You could get your hands on a mug of mead or ale regardless of your standing in society, though the quality of the drink might differ. The nobles, for instance, had access to higher quality wine, while peasants drank ale that was often made with less refined ingredients. But the crucial point is that the tavern was the one place where the common man could feel like he was on an equal footing with the elites. The conversation might be more cordial or casual among nobles, but when it came to drinking, everyone was doing it together. Still, there were clear distinctions, even in the tavern. When nobles visited, they often had their own space, a corner or a private room, where they could enjoy their drink and discuss matters of importance away from the prying eyes of commoners. For the rest of the population, the tavern was a free-for-all. Tables filled quickly, especially during harvest festivals or major celebrations. If you didn't get there early, you could easily find yourself standing or sitting in a crowded corner trying to hear the latest gossip over the roar of the room. Historians still argue whether the tavern's relatively relaxed nature allowed for a more harmonious social environment, or whether it simply masked the tension that simmered just beneath the surface. Some scholars argue that while taverns did serve as meeting places where nobles and peasants could mingle, it wasn't always as peaceful as it seemed. You could find yourself in a deep conversation with a local merchant one minute and being thrown out of the tavern the next because of a minor misunderstanding. The reality of the medieval tavern was that while alcohol could bring people together, it could also exacerbate social friction. The alcohol flowed freely, but so did the tempers. Yet for all the violence and occasional chaos, the tavern was essential for maintaining the social order. Think about it. It was a place where people could meet, talk, and share ideas. For the merchant, it was an opportunity to discuss trade deals with other merchants or potential buyers. For the peasant, it was a chance to catch up on the latest gossip, which could include news of wars, famine, or even royal decrees. As you sit there, the air thick with smoke, you can almost hear the hushed conversations about the politics of the time. And though these conversations were mostly idle chatter, it was within these tavern walls that real change often began, whether through a well-placed alliance or the stirring of a rebellion. But let's not get too carried away with the grandiose. While the tavern might have been a place for higher aspirations, it was still, at its heart, a place where the day's frustrations could be drowned in a mug of ale. After all, the life of the common folk wasn't easy, and the tavern served as an important outlet for them to escape their hardships, albeit temporarily. The tavern was a safe place, a place to forget the pressures of the outside world, and for some it was a temporary relief from their social status. On a more practical level, the tavern also played an essential role in the local economy. The drinks weren't cheap, but they were affordable enough that a large portion of the population could indulge. It wasn't uncommon for entire communities to gather at the local tavern after a hard day's work. In fact, taverns often acted as informal banks. People would leave coins or valuables with the tavern keeper for safekeeping, and the keeper would sometimes act as an unofficial moneylender. You'd get a drink, and if you were lucky, the keeper might even offer some sage advice or a connection for your business dealings. What's fascinating, is how drinking was integral to these everyday interactions. Imagine sitting there, looking at the faces around you, people from different walks of life, each with their own problems, dreams, and ambitions. And what do they all have in common? A shared experience, the drink. It was the central element in a communal activity, and while the quality might have varied, the act of drinking together was the great equalizer. Now, the tavern keeper, an essential figure in this whole social experiment, had to be shrewd, crafty, and in some cases ruthless. After all, not just anyone could manage a space like this. They had to balance the needs of various social classes, keep the peace as best as possible, and ensure that the tavern remained profitable. The tavern keeper's job wasn't all fun and games. It was a delicate dance of maintaining order and keeping the customers coming back. If you got on the wrong side of the keeper, you might find yourself tossed out on the street before you could finish your last drink. But even as the tavern keeper maintained the delicate balance between social classes, the question remained, did the tavern truly serve as a bridge between these classes, or was it simply a place where they could coexist barely? The history is unclear on this point. Some scholars argue that it was the tavern that helped break down barriers, creating a space where people could talk freely and exchange ideas, no matter their rank. Others believe that the tavern only served to reinforce existing divisions, as the higher classes would often retreat to their own private rooms or drink more expensive beverages that were inaccessible to the common folk. In any case, the tavern remained the heart of medieval society, a place of both camaraderie and tension, where the lines between social class were sometimes blurred but always drawn back again by the reality of the world outside. You've only just begun to see how the dynamics inside this small, smoky room can reflect the larger struggles and aspirations of a society on the brink of great change. As you settle deeper into your seat, the clink of mugs and the murmur of conversation continues around you, but there's something else in the air tonight, the promise of another drink. You've heard it mentioned already, but let's take a moment to really explore what's in your mug. In medieval taverns, the choice of drink wasn't as straightforward as it is today. There was no craft beer or signature cocktail menu. No, here it was all about the basics: ale, mead, and wine. But within those basic choices lay a whole world of variety, and understanding what you're drinking tells you more about the medieval world than you might think. Ale, the drink of the common folk, was probably the most ubiquitous in a medieval tavern. It was the standard, served in hearty wooden mugs or clay cups, filled to the brim and often slightly cloudy, thick with yeast. Ale was brewed locally, and it came in many variations, some better than others. If you were a peasant, you might be drinking a rougher version with ingredients that varied depending on what could be grown or harvested in the area. There was no strict recipe, and the brewing process was often done by the local tavern keeper, whose skills in making ale could either make you or break you as a patron. The drinking process itself was an event. You weren't just sipping this drink, you were experiencing it. Ale was often slightly diluted with water to make it last longer, as strong, undiluted ale could be quite overpowering and dangerous. The flavour could vary from sweet to bitter depending on the grains used, and the strength could be anything from mild to potent enough to knock you out cold if you weren't careful. The strong variety was often reserved for special occasions, where the goal wasn't just to drink but to get merry, or perhaps even to forget the crushing weight of medieval life for a short time. And then there was mead, a drink often reserved for the wealthier class but still found in many taverns. Mead, made from fermented honey, water, and sometimes fruit or spices, was an intoxicating drink that held a certain prestige. While ale might have been the staple for everyday folk, mead was often seen as a more luxurious choice. If you were sitting in a tavern and ordered mead, you were signalling to the world that you had taste, or at least a bit of money. The process of making mead was far more refined than brewing ale, requiring careful attention to the honey and fermenting process. Mead also came in many varieties: dry, sweet, spiced, each adding its own layer to the drinking experience. If you were lucky, you might get to sample a unique variety that was only available in a particular region or tavern. Then, of course, there was wine. In many taverns, particularly those near trade routes, wine was a prized commodity. While it wasn't as common as ale, especially for the lower classes, it was still an important part of the drinking culture. The medieval world wasn't just about local ale anymore. Wine was becoming more popular. The best wine, of course, was imported from places like France or Italy. but the poor were far less likely to enjoy such delicacies. Their wine was likely watered down, often mixed with spices or herbs to mask its inferior quality. Still, even a poor man could appreciate a simple cup of wine, and its cultural significance was undeniable. Wine in the medieval tavern wasn't just about drinking, it was a social statement, and for the nobility or wealthy merchant class, a glass of wine could signify their elevated status. What's fascinating here is that these drinks were much more than mere alcohol. They were deeply embedded in the fabric of medieval society. Ale and mead weren't just beverages, they were daily necessities, often consumed at every meal. Some even believed that drinking them provided health benefits, helping to ward off illness, or even cure minor ailments. Think about it, most people didn't drink water as much as we do today. In medieval times, drinking water was risky, often contaminated and unsafe, so alcohol became a safer alternative, a method of purifying liquid that wouldn't make you sick. The ale was often low in alcohol content, but it had enough of a fermented bite to make it somewhat safer than drinking water from the local river. It was, in many ways, an early form of self-medication, though not always an effective one. But here's the kicker. Even with all these options for drinking, the medieval tavern wasn't just a place to enjoy a drink. It was a place where people gathered to exchange stories, gossip, and even engage in heated debates. When a traveller came to town, the tavern would be the first stop to share news of the outside world. The drink itself served as a catalyst for conversation, and it wasn't unusual for patrons to get carried away in a story, especially after a few too many sips. Tales of distant lands, kingdoms at war, and royal intrigue were often shared by those who had the inside scoop, and the tavern was where those stories gained legs. Historians still debate whether these tavern tales had any factual basis, or if they were just exaggerated fictions created to pass the time as the ale flowed freely. Regardless of whether the stories were true, the tavern was the place where the larger-than-life world outside the village came to life in the minds of those who gathered there. The tavern became a sort of cultural epicenter, a place where rumours took shape and legends were born, and at the heart of it all, alcohol, always flowing, always present, always part of the tale. In fact, drinking in medieval taverns was so central to social life that there were even rituals associated with it. For example, in some taverns there were specific toasts or blessings before the first drink was taken. These toasts could be simple blessings for good health or safety, or they could be more elaborate, calling on the gods or spirits to watch over the drinkers for the evening. In this sense, drinking wasn't just a physical act, it was also a spiritual one. These rituals were woven into the very fabric of the tavern experience, adding another layer of meaning to the drink in your hand. But of course, not all tavern rituals were so benevolent. Some taverns, especially in the more lawless regions, had their own darker customs. In the rougher parts of Europe, it was said that people used the tavern as a place to settle scores, whether it was through a duel or a less-than-friendly game of dice. The alcohol would be flowing, but so would the tempers, and what started as a friendly gathering could quickly escalate into something more sinister. So as you sip your ale, mead or wine, take a moment to consider the role your drink is playing in this scene. It's not just alcohol, it's part of the social fabric, part of the shared experience that makes the tavern the place to be. Whether you're drinking with a nobleman or a peasant, the act of drinking is what binds everyone together. The next sip you take might be one of camaraderie, or it might be one of frustration, but either way, you're participating in a centuries-old tradition that connects you to the past. As you sit there, your drink in hand, you might be wondering who exactly is in charge of all this chaos around you, who makes sure the ale keeps flowing, the tables stay stocked, and things don't get out of hand when tempers flare. Enter the tavern keeper. This person isn't just a bartender. They're a central figure in the social dynamics of the tavern, the gatekeeper of the evening's entertainment, and in many cases, the final word on any conflict that might arise. The tavern keeper was one of the most influential figures in the medieval tavern. They were responsible for keeping the place running smoothly, maintaining the inventory, and making sure that things didn't get too rowdy, or if they did, managing the fallout. It wasn't an easy job, not by a long shot. It required not just the ability to manage an establishment, but also to read people, diffuse tension, and, when necessary, act as an enforcer. But unlike modern-day bartenders, tavern keepers in medieval times often held a much more prominent social role. In smaller towns, they were the glue that held the community together, and in larger cities, they could act as unofficial leaders in their own right. The tavern keeper's duties went beyond serving drinks. They were also responsible for ensuring that the tavern stayed within the bounds of local law. They were expected to monitor patrons closely, making sure no one was breaking any laws, whether it was related to drinking too much, starting fights, or causing any disturbances in the neighborhood. If there was a crime, the tavern keeper was usually the one to handle it, at least until the authorities arrived. Often they had to make tough calls, deciding whether to kick out a troublesome patron, bar a rowdy group from entering, or break up a heated brawl before it escalated into something more dangerous. Of course, not all tavern keepers were models of morality. In fact, many tavern keepers were known for having a bit of a rough edge themselves. Some came from military backgrounds, others from criminal circles, but regardless of their past, they all shared one thing in common. They had to be tough, because tavern goers were rarely docile. If a fight broke out, they had to put a stop to it. Fast. Sometimes the tavern keeper would use physical force, either by getting involved in the brawl themselves or by simply throwing people out into the street. Other times they might resort to more subtle tactics, like quietly warning the instigators or using the threat of future consequences to keep the peace. Interestingly, the role of the tavern keeper wasn't always just about maintaining order. In many ways, they were also the heart of the tavern's entertainment. They knew the local gossip, had the inside scoop on the latest news, and were often the ones who could get you a seat near the most influential people in the room. Tavern keepers often had a finger on the pulse of the local community, knowing exactly who was who and who to avoid. They were a source of information, advice, and even entertainment. Some were known for telling jokes, singing songs, or even organizing tavern games to keep the crowd engaged. In a way, they were the unofficial masters of ceremony for these social hubs. But the job came with its own set of challenges. Medieval taverns were notorious for their unruly patrons, and it wasn't uncommon for tavern keepers to face personal danger when they intervened in a brawl. While a tavern keeper's word was often final in disputes, if things went too far, the authorities would eventually step in, and the tavern keeper could face punishment for letting things get out of control. The medieval justice system didn't look kindly on those who allowed lawlessness to flourish in their establishments, so tavern keepers had to walk a fine line between being a strict enforcer and maintaining a friendly, welcoming atmosphere. But it wasn't all about enforcement. Tavern keepers were also responsible for managing the business side of things, ensuring that they made a profit. They had to keep track of inventory, order supplies, and ensure that they weren't wasting alcohol or food. In some cases, tavern keepers even managed multiple establishments. In these situations, they were often responsible for recruiting and training new staff, making sure that they upheld the tavern's standards. This often meant knowing a lot about brewing, food preparation, and customer service, all of which made tavern keeping a much more complex job than most people realized. In some towns, tavern keepers were also responsible for other services, like providing lodging for travelers. In these cases, the tavern would often double as an inn, with rooms available for rent on the second floor. The tavern keeper would also be responsible for ensuring that guests were comfortable and that the property was well maintained. If a guest was particularly important, the tavern keeper might even offer them special accommodations or assign a servant to tend to their needs. Tavern keepers weren't just essential to the functioning of the tavern. They were essential to the functioning of medieval society. Without them, the tavern would have been little more than a chaotic free-for-all with no order or structure. The tavern keeper provided that structure, ensuring that patrons had a safe, enjoyable experience, while also making sure that things didn't get too out of hand. Of course, there were those who took advantage of the power that came with being a tavern keeper. It wasn't uncommon for tavern keepers to exploit their position for personal gain. Some would secretly add extra charges to customers' bills, while others might pocket the change from tips. There were even stories of tavern keepers who ran illegal activities on the side, such as gambling rings or smuggling operations. However, most tavern keepers took their responsibilities seriously, seeing themselves as guardians of the tavern and the community that depended on it. As you sit back and look around the room, you might begin to appreciate the complexity of the role the tavern keeper played in the medieval world. They were not just bartenders or business owners, they were the linchpins in the social structure of the tavern. They held the power to control the flow of the evening, to ensure that disputes didn't escalate into violence, and to manage the delicate balance between the tavern's patrons. Without them, the tavern wouldn't have been the vibrant, chaotic, and sometimes dangerous place it was. Now, you take another sip of your drink, and as the tavern keeper walks past, you realize that the person behind the bar isn't just serving you, they're holding the entire world of this tavern together. As the evening deepens, the flickering candlelight casts long shadows on the wooden beams above, and the clinking of mugs and murmur of voices continues in the background. But amidst all the chatter and the heavy air of anticipation, there's something more to the medieval tavern experience, something that goes beyond just the drink and the occasional brawl. It's the myth, the mystique, and most intriguingly, the medicinal belief that alcohol was good for you. That's right, in medieval times, drinking wasn't just for relaxation or recreation. It was often considered essential for maintaining good health. You've heard of medicinal alcohol before, right? It's not as new as you think. In the medieval period, people genuinely believed that alcohol had healing powers, especially the brews served in taverns. This wasn't just a trend, it was widely accepted by both the common folk and, believe it or not, the educated classes. For a time, doctors and apothecaries even recommended drinking alcohol as a cure for everything from the common cold to the Black Death. Whether it was ale, wine, or mead, drinking was often seen as a way to fight illness, improve digestion, or boost your spirits. But don't expect the drinks served in medieval taverns to be the equivalent of your modern-day craft beers or fine wines. The quality of the alcohol was, at best, variable, and at worst, downright questionable. The brewing process was primitive, and while it produced beverages that could certainly get you drunk, they didn't always meet the standards of cleanliness we might expect today. There were no regulations to ensure quality control, so it was entirely possible that what you were drinking was far less refined than anything you'd find in today's pubs. The risk of contamination was ever present, and sometimes drinking could leave you feeling more ill than better. But here's where things get interesting. Despite the lack of hygiene and quality control, the medieval world still embraced the idea that alcohol was a necessary part of daily life, even for health reasons. In fact, many people didn't even consider water to be a safe drink. Rivers and wells were often polluted, and the idea of drinking water straight from the source was seen as dangerous. So what did people do? They drank beer and ale because, unlike water, it was fermented, which meant that the alcohol content could kill off harmful bacteria. In essence, drinking alcohol was safer than drinking water, and for this reason, ale was often consumed with every meal, much like a staple food. Medieval taverns often served their alcohol in a variety of ways to enhance its supposed medicinal properties. For instance, mead was considered to have restorative qualities thanks to the honey that formed its base. People believed that honey was not only a sweet treat, but a magical substance that could heal wounds, soothe sore throats, and restore strength to the weary. Mead was often consumed by the nobility for its supposed restorative properties, but it wasn't limited to just the elite. It was enjoyed by all levels of society, albeit in different qualities. The more refined mead, made with special herbs or spices, was reserved for the wealthy, while the simpler versions were consumed by the working class. Historians still argue whether people truly believed in the healing powers of alcohol or whether it was more of a cultural placebo effect. After all, there was a heavy reliance on superstition and folklore during this period, and many of the medicinal claims surrounding alcohol were passed down through generations as part of the medieval tradition. However, it's clear that alcohol played a crucial role in everyday life, not only as a social lubricant, but also as a perceived tool for health and longevity. Even those with the most basic knowledge of medicine in medieval times understood the importance of fermentation and the potential benefits of drinking fermented beverages, especially in a world where clean water was a rare commodity. But the idea of medicinal alcohol didn't just stop at curing illnesses, it extended to the belief that alcohol could purify the body and the soul. The consumption of mead, ale, and wine was thought to improve digestion, balance the humours, and, in some cases, even prevent bad dreams or nightmares. People believed that drinking before bed could ensure a restful sleep, free of evil spirits or bad dreams. While this was clearly rooted in superstition, it still speaks to the central role that alcohol played in the lives of medieval people, both physically and spiritually. Tavern owners would sometimes promote these supposed health benefits to attract customers, claiming that their brew could cure any number of ailments. It wasn't unusual for a tavern keeper to tout their special concoction, which might have been made with secret herbs, spices, or other medicinal ingredients. These drinks were advertised as tonics that would revitalize a person after a hard day's labor. While these claims were likely exaggerated, there was no doubt that alcohol was seen as an essential part of self-care in the medieval world. In a society where medical care was limited and often ineffective, a good drink from the local tavern might have been the only remedy people felt they needed. Of course, like most things in medieval life, the reality was far less straightforward. While some believed that alcohol had curative powers, others were all too aware of the dangers it could bring. Excessive drinking led to all kinds of problems, from social unrest to personal health issues, and medieval taverns were no strangers to the darker side of alcohol. Even as people drank for what they believed were health benefits, there was also an undeniable risk of overindulgence. Tavern brawls, feuds, and even violent outbursts could be attributed to the very substance that was supposed to bring relief. Yet, despite the risk, the concept of alcohol as a health elixir remained deeply ingrained in medieval culture. The idea that alcohol could cure ailments, improve mood, and ward off disease was pervasive, even though we now know that many of these beliefs were based on misinformation. In the medieval world, alcohol was seen as a life-sustaining drink, not just for socializing, but for survival itself. For a society without modern medicine or knowledge of germs and bacteria, alcohol served as both a physical and psychological crutch, sometimes even in the form of a tonic. As you sit there, sipping your drink, you realize that what you're holding is more than just alcohol, it's a symbol of survival. In a world where medicine was rudimentary at best, and clean drinking water was a luxury, the tavern served as a place of refuge. The drink in your hand might have been your best defense against illness, your remedy for the day's fatigue, and your gateway to a better night's sleep. It's not just about the taste or the intoxication, it's about the tradition, the beliefs, and the role alcohol played in medieval life. And as you look around at the other patrons, it's clear. They're all partaking in the same ritual, the same belief that alcohol isn't just a drink. It's a cure-all, a vital part of their world. As you sit back, the warmth from your drink slowly spreading through your body, it's hard not to notice the palpable energy around you. You're no longer just a passive observer. you're part of the scene now. The conversation ebbs and flows, punctuated by laughter and the occasional raised voice. This is a place where not only stories are told, but also where games are played. And let's be clear, these aren't the board games or card games we're used to today. Medieval tavern games were rough, rowdy, and more often than not, fueled by alcohol. They were an essential part of the tavern experience, adding an extra layer of chaos and entertainment to an already unpredictable environment. Tavern games were the heart of the action for many patrons. After all, a long day of labour deserved some form of distraction, and what better way to let off steam than a game that involved drinking? Whether you were a seasoned local or a traveller passing through, there was no shortage of games to participate in. The most common of these were dice games, where luck, or rather the lack of it, could make or break your night. Dice were easy to come by, and their randomness was the perfect complement to the often chaotic tavern atmosphere. Whether you were rolling for small stakes or huge wagers, the excitement of a dice game was enough to get anyone involved. But dice games weren't the only entertainment on offer. Another popular tavern game was something called Nine Men's Morris, a strategy board game that involved placing pieces on a grid, aiming to create rows of 3. This game was a mental challenge in the midst of all the alcohol-fueled mayhem around you. While it wasn't as rowdy as some of the other tavern games, it was nonetheless an important part of the medieval tavern culture. It offered a chance for people to test their wits in a quiet corner of the tavern, away from the larger, more chaotic drinking games. And then there were the drinking challenges. These could range from simple contests of who could drink the most in the shortest time to more complex games involving riddles or challenges between competitors. You'd see tables full of men, sometimes women, raising their mugs, trying to outdrink each other without spilling a drop. For some, it was all about pride. For others, it was about survival. A good drinker in the medieval world wasn't just a strong soul, he was someone who could hold his liquor and maintain his dignity in front of a rowdy crowd. If you couldn't handle your alcohol, you might find yourself ridiculed, or worse, tossed out of the tavern entirely. But it wasn't all about high-stakes games. Some of the more relaxed tavern games were a form of bonding, a way to build camaraderie among the tavern-goers. Ring the Horn was a particularly fun one, where players tried to hook a ring onto a stick. The trick was that the ring had to be tossed while holding a drink in your other hand, making it just that much more difficult. It wasn't about winning or losing, it was about sharing the experience, having fun, and of course, drinking. Even if the games were mostly light-hearted, there was always a bit of tension in the air. The tavern was a place where rivalries could easily escalate. Whether you were playing a simple dice game or a round of ring toss, the stakes could quickly grow higher, fueled by alcohol and a desire for respect. Taverns had their fair share of feuds, and the games that took place within those walls were sometimes a microcosm of the bigger conflicts happening outside. A challenge to a game could turn into a challenge to someone's pride, and with alcohol flowing freely, the stakes weren't always just about the game. It could be about your reputation. Of course, tavern games weren't just a way to kill time. They were also a way to create bonds. People from different walks of life could come together over a game of dice or a round of Ring the Horn, forgetting about the differences that might separate them outside the tavern walls. In some ways, the tavern acted as a social equalizer, a place where you could be on the same level as everyone else, regardless of your social status or occupation. But this equality was an illusion. Alcohol, after all, had a way of revealing truths, of bringing out the best and the worst in people. Take the game of Kick the Ladder, for example. It was a simple game, often played in smaller taverns with lower ceilings, where patrons would try to knock over a small ladder with a well-timed kick. But when tensions ran high or wagers were placed, this simple game could quickly spiral into something more dangerous. A misplaced kick, a wrong move, or even a drunken mistake could set off a fight, and before long, the tavern was full of angry patrons shouting and brawling. This wasn't uncommon in medieval taverns, where games often acted as a catalyst for conflict rather than just harmless fun. But here's the kicker. Tavern games were also an important source of entertainment for the community. Many taverns hosted tournaments or larger events, drawing in large crowds who came to witness the spectacle. Imagine a local tavern hosting a drinking competition where the prize was a week's worth of free drinks or a fine meal. The event would attract the town's best drinkers, and spectators would crowd around to cheer on their favourites, placing bets and enjoying the sheer spectacle of it all. In some cases, these games weren't just for fun. Tavern games were also a way of passing down traditions. Many medieval games had roots in ancient rituals or ceremonies, and they were played not only for entertainment but also to maintain the connection to the past. Games were a way of keeping history alive, even if that history was based on superstition or folklore. The games may have changed over time, but the spirit of competition and community remained central to the medieval tavern experience. And then, of course, there were the infamous drinking songs. These weren't so much games as they were a form of group participation that involved music, singing, and, you guessed it, drinking. These songs would often be sung in a loud, rowdy manner, with the crowd joining in as they emptied their mugs. They were as much a social bonding exercise as they were a way to pass the time, and everyone had a favourite drinking song. The lyrics could vary, but they always had one thing in common. They were about drinking, partying, and the joys of being in the tavern. The beauty of these games and songs was that they helped weave a sense of belonging among tavern-goers. No matter where you came from, no matter your social class, once you were in the tavern, you were part of the larger experience. You could get caught up in the games, the laughter, and the revelry. It was a space where, at least for the night, social distinctions blurred, and the shared experience of drinking, playing games, and singing songs took precedence over everything else. In a way, it was one of the few places where all were equal. So, as the night wears on, you can't help but feel the camaraderie and the connection to those around you. The tavern is alive with energy, fueled by alcohol, games, and the simple human desire to escape the harshness of life. You're not just a spectator, you're part of the evening's entertainment. And as you raise your mug for another round, you realize that this isn't just about the drink. It's about the experience, the games, the laughter, the tension, and the community that holds it all together. The mood shifts as the night deepens and the energy in the tavern begins to take on a more dangerous edge. The games may be fun, the conversation's light-hearted, but there's a darker undercurrent that you can't ignore. As the alcohol continues to flow and the tavern fills up, the threat of violence seems to simmer just beneath the surface. Tavern brawls were a regular feature of medieval life, and in a place where alcohol is consumed freely, it didn't take much for a playful challenge or a harsh word to spark chaos. Tavern brawls were an inevitable part of the medieval drinking culture, and if you spent any amount of time in a tavern, you were bound to witness at least one. These weren't your typical bar fights. They were often brutal, unrestrained affairs that could result in serious injury, or worse. It wasn't unusual for people to get so caught up in the heat of the moment that they would throw punches over trivial matters like spilled beer, a bad bet, or a slight that could have been easily ignored. The key ingredient here was alcohol. You see, drinking not only loosened tongues, but also loosened inhibitions, and when the alcohol hit, tempers flared. As you sit there, watching the scene unfold around you, you begin to understand just how fragile the social order is in a place like this. Sure, there's a sense of camaraderie and equal footing, but that can quickly dissolve when someone's pride is wounded, or when too much drink has clouded a person's judgment. Sometimes, all it takes is a few harsh words between strangers, and suddenly the tavern is full of shouting, stumbling bodies, and the clatter of chairs being knocked over. The tavern keeper, of course, is quick to step in, but it's not always enough to prevent things from escalating. And even if the tavern keeper manages to break up the fight, the damage has often been done. But let's not get too grim. Tones isn't always like this, and most tavern visits didn't end in violence. For every brawl, there were countless evenings where people sat, drank, and left the tavern without incident. But the threat of violence was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, and this volatility was part of what made the tavern such a unique space in medieval society. It wasn't just a place to drink, it was a place where power, pride, and status were constantly in flux. A tavern brawl could reshape relationships, damage reputations, or even alter the course of someone's life. Interestingly, tavern brawls often revealed something deeper about medieval society. You see, these public displays of aggression weren't just about personal conflict, they were also about the underlying tensions in the larger community. The tavern was a microcosm of the world outside, and the fights that broke out within its walls often mirrored the struggles that existed in the broader social landscape. Whether it was a dispute over resources, a rivalry between two local families, or simply a clash of egos, the tavern was where these conflicts came to a head, and more often than not, alcohol played a significant role in pushing those conflicts to the surface. Historians still debate the exact causes of tavern brawls, but one thing is certain: alcohol, combined with the lack of social control, created the perfect environment for violence to erupt. The tavern, with its dark corners, rough tables, and crowds of boisterous patrons, was often a powder keg just waiting to explode. Once a fight started, it was usually left to the tavern keeper and the other patrons to break it up, though this was rarely a smooth process. Some taverns had a reputation for being particularly rough, attracting the kind of patrons who were looking for trouble, while others maintained a level of order thanks to the vigilance of the tavern keeper. In some cases, the tavern keeper might even go so far as to call for help from the local authorities if things got too out of hand. But in most cases, the response was far more immediate. The tavern keeper would throw the offending parties out on the street, often with a warning not to return. However, this wasn't always a permanent solution. A man tossed out of one tavern might simply move on to the next one, where he could start a fresh round of trouble. Despite this inherent risk of violence, tavern goers were often willing to take it on. After all, the tavern was a place where people came to escape their everyday lives, to forget the hard work, the political struggles, and the tensions of the outside world. In the medieval world, where life was often harsh and unpredictable, the tavern was one of the few places where you could let loose and have some control, even if it meant engaging in a bit of rowdiness. And for some, the violence was part of the attraction. To be involved in a brawl, even as a passive participant, could lend you a certain amount of street credibility. For many, the tavern was a place where your reputation could be made or destroyed based on how you handled yourself in a fight. This wasn't just about survival, it was about asserting dominance, earning respect, and proving that you were tough enough to hold your ground in a rough world. In a way, the tavern brawl was as much about social currency as it was about physical confrontation. You could walk into the tavern as a nobody, but if you left after a fight, whether you won or lost, people would remember you. You might become part of the tavern's folklore, talked about in hushed tones by future patrons who would recount the night you got involved in the brawl with the local butcher, or the time you stood your ground against the town's best drinker. But let's pause for a moment. Not every tavern experience was fraught with the threat of violence. For most people, the tavern was just a place to have a drink, socialize, and escape the stress of daily life. While fights were certainly a part of the atmosphere, they didn't define the experience for everyone. The tavern was a place for companionship, for laughter, for shared stories. And even though there was always the risk of a brawl breaking out, most patrons found comfort in the familiarity of the tavern's noisy, warm embrace. But as you sit here, you can't help but feel the tension in the air, the possibility that things could quickly turn. And it's not just the alcohol fueling the risk. It's the way these tavern interactions serve as a reflection of the larger tensions that were present in medieval society. What begins as a friendly exchange can, in an instant, turn into a struggle for power, respect, or survival. The tavern is a place where the personal and the social collide, and where the rules of the outside world are momentarily suspended. And in this world, even the smallest conflict could have big consequences. As you absorb the scene around you, another factor starts to sink in. While tavern brawls are what people often remember, it's the hidden dangers of medieval drinks themselves that could present the real peril. The risks weren't just the violent outbursts or the occasional fight. The drinks themselves carried dangers that went beyond their intoxicating effects. Sure, taverns were a refuge from the day-to-day grind, but they were also places where you might find yourself at risk of far more than just a bad hangover. When you think of medieval tavern drinks, you likely imagine ale and mead, but the truth is there were plenty of other hidden risks associated with these drinks. Brewing techniques were rudimentary at best, and the cleanliness of both the brewing process and the tavern itself left much to be desired. The harshness of medieval life, where sanitation and hygiene were often overlooked, meant that the very thing people turned to for relief, alcohol, was a double-edged sword. Tavern ales, though often seen as safer than water, were brewed in unsanitary conditions, with equipment that hadn't been properly cleaned. Imagine drinking from a mug that was shared by dozens of patrons throughout the day, each with their own germs and potentially dangerous diseases. The lack of proper sterilization meant that even the drink you were consuming could be a breeding ground for bacteria. And this wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a real health risk. There was a very real possibility of contracting illnesses like dysentery, typhoid, and various forms of food poisoning from the very drink you were relying on to quench your thirst. Tavern keepers, while responsible for serving, weren't always aware of these dangers, as medical knowledge about cleanliness and germs was nearly non-existent. In addition to the basic hygiene concerns, some drinks were dangerously high in alcohol content. While drinking alcohol in medieval times was more of a necessity than a luxury, the overindulgence in some of these stronger beverages could lead to serious consequences. The ale served in medieval taverns wasn't the light, watery stuff we associate with beer today. It was often thick, high in alcohol, and consumed in large quantities. A single pint of strong medieval ale could have the same alcohol content as several modern beers, and when you're in an environment like the tavern, filled with rowdy patrons gambling and games, it doesn't take much for that drink to go from fun to dangerous in the blink of an eye. But there's another layer to this, the sometimes disturbing ingredients used to create these beverages. Medieval tavern keepers didn't have access to the refined processes we use today, so they had to get creative with what was available to them. They might add herbs, spices, or fruits to their drinks, not necessarily for flavor, but often for medicinal purposes. While some ingredients were chosen for their beneficial effects on the body, others were frankly questionable. There are records of tavern keepers adding substances like opium, hallucinogenic plants, or even poisonous plants to their brews. The goal wasn't always intoxication. It was sometimes about creating a stronger drink or amplifying its effects. While the inclusion of such dangerous ingredients was far from universal, it was certainly present in some regions, particularly in larger cities or taverns known for their wild parties. And then there were the substances that were simply used to spice up the drinks, making them more palatable. There are accounts of medieval people drinking flavoured beverages made with things like spoiled milk or rancid meat juices. The idea was that the spices or herbs could mask the unpleasant flavours, but all they really did was mask the rot. In some cases, what you were drinking might have been better left alone, or perhaps even avoided altogether. This wasn't a problem just for the poor. Even the wealthier classes could find themselves drinking something potentially dangerous. In fact, nobles often consumed the same drinks, albeit with added luxury, like fruit or imported spices, which could still contain harmful additives or be prepared under unsanitary conditions. The real kicker, though, is that these potential dangers were largely invisible to the drinkers of the time. People didn't have the medical understanding we have today about bacteria, fermentation, and contamination. For the average tavern goer, the drink was simply part of the experience, an expected part of socializing, relaxing, and unwinding. But what they couldn't know was that just below the surface of the frothy ale, dangerous bacteria or toxic substances might be lurking. Historians still argue whether these health risks were ever truly understood in medieval society, or if they were simply accepted as a part of life. While it's clear that some individuals were aware of the risks, many simply didn't have the tools or knowledge to address the dangers inherent in the drinking culture. Instead, they relied on folk remedies and superstitions, believing that alcohol had healing powers that would somehow ward off disease or protect them from harm. And while it's true that alcohol could kill harmful bacteria, it wasn't a foolproof defense. There were still plenty of opportunities to get sick, and disease could spread quickly in an environment like a crowded tavern. It's easy to imagine how dangerous it could be for someone to drink in a tavern that wasn't properly maintaining its equipment, or where the drinks themselves weren't well regulated. The truth is that the tavern environment was a hazardous one. From the potential for alcohol poisoning to the diseases that could be spread by shared drinking vessels, the tavern was a place where risk was always on the horizon. But this wasn't just a problem for the lower classes. Even the wealthier tavern-goers had their own concerns. The elite often frequented taverns that served more refined imported wines. While these wines may have been safer than the local ale, they came with their own issues. Imported wines were often mixed with various additives like honey, resin, or even lead to preserve the drink or enhance its flavor. These additives could cause serious long-term health problems, especially lead poisoning. The noble classes, in their pursuit of luxury, might have been even more at risk of drinking something harmful than the poor folk drinking their humble ale. The real danger, though, lay in the unknown. The people drinking in medieval taverns simply didn't know the risks they were facing. They drank not only for recreation, but for survival, and it's only with the benefit of hindsight that we can see how perilous their drinking habits could be. But in a world where clean water was hard to come by, where disease was rampant, and where medical knowledge was limited, alcohol was one of the few things people relied on. So, the tavern kept its place as a vital social hub, despite the dangers it concealed. As you sit there with your drink, you realize that the very beverage in your hand carries with it the weight of centuries of tradition, danger, and survival. It's not just the drink you're sharing with those around you. It's the very essence of medieval life, and though it's easy to laugh off the more bizarre aspects of medieval drinking culture, it's clear that it was a way of life that came with risk. The night grows older, and you've noticed how the atmosphere has shifted. The room feels thicker now, as if the weight of the day's chaos has settled into the bones of the tavern. People have started to relax into their own little corners, some lingering over the last dregs of their drinks, others sharing whispered conversations. In the back, you hear the shuffle of feet and the scrape of chairs as tavern-goers try to get comfortable for a long evening ahead. Amidst the noise and drunken chatter, there's a quieter undercurrent to this whole affair, something deeper that runs through the fabric of the tavern experience, and that is, of course, the role of the tavern as a social institution. The tavern wasn't just a place to drink. In fact, the medieval tavern was often considered the heart of the community, where local news, rumours and political gossip all swirled together in an intoxicating mix of half-truths and outright fabrications. Taverns were social hubs in ways that modern bars and pubs, for all their modern conveniences, simply aren't. Sure, today we have social media, coffee shops, and constant connectivity, but for the people of medieval towns, the tavern was the closest thing to a public forum. It wasn't just where you came to unwind, it was where you came to learn what was happening in your village or in the larger world beyond. A tavern was often where news broke. If the king had made a new decree, or if there was unrest in the town, or if there was talk of an impending war, chances were the first place it would be heard was in the local tavern. When you walked into the tavern, you weren't just stepping into a social space, you were entering the pulse of the local world. The tavern was the place where people gathered to exchange information, share stories, and discuss everything from the mundane to the monumental. For many medieval villagers, the tavern was the centre of their social life, a place where you didn't just sip your drink, you absorbed the latest developments in the region or even further afield. But here's the catch. While news spread fast in taverns, it was rarely 100% accurate. Tavern gossip was often a jumble of facts, rumours and hearsay. The line between truth and fiction was frequently blurred, and in some cases, tavern goers would have been more likely to get their information from an enthusiastic storyteller than from a reliable source. The reliability of the news didn't always matter, though, because the tavern was a place where people were looking for connection more than anything else. Whether it was a rumour about a royal marriage, the latest local scandal, or a heated political debate, the tavern was the place where these stories came to life. It's fascinating, really, when you think about how different this is from today's news cycles. Today, information is rapid, precise, and easily verified. But back then, it was all about the word of mouth, often passed along through ale-soaked lips in darkened corners of a smoky tavern. People didn't have 24-hour news stations to rely on. What they had was the tavern, and in many cases, the tavern keeper was the one who helped filter this information. The tavern keeper, after all, wasn't just serving drinks. They were also one of the best informed people in town. Whether they were personally involved in the community's affairs or simply overhearing the latest gossip, the tavern keeper often had a wealth of knowledge that could shape the social fabric of the village. But not all the news shared in the tavern was light-hearted or harmless. Sometimes the news that passed through these walls was far more sinister. Taverns were also where you'd hear whispers of political unrest, or where the underground dealings of the town's criminal elements were talked about openly, under the guise of a casual conversation. In fact, taverns were notorious for being gathering spots for all kinds of illegal activities. Smuggling rings, black market trades, and even the planning of rebellions could be initiated and plotted in the back rooms of taverns. And in some cases, tavern keepers themselves were complicit, either because they were part of the schemes or because they had little choice but to turn a blind eye in order to keep their business running smoothly. But what about the common folk who were just looking to hear the news of the day? For them, the tavern was a place where they could catch up on the latest happenings, often while enjoying a cheap mug of ale. However, this flow of information was not without its dangers. Tavern gossip was a powerful tool, and what you overheard in one tavern could affect your standing in the community. You could find yourself embroiled in a scandal simply by associating with the wrong person or by being caught in the wrong conversation. People were, after all, eager to pass on information, but they were also quick to judge others based on that information. The tavern could be a place of community and camaraderie, but it could also be a place where social divisions and suspicions festered. The tavern also played a key role in shaping the community's sense of identity. It was a place where local events were discussed, where alliances were formed, and where everyone, from peasants to nobles, could engage with the social fabric of their town. For many people, it wasn't just about what was happening in the wider world. It was about their local world, the one they lived in and interacted with daily. The tavern allowed people to feel connected to that world, even if the news wasn't always encouraging or uplifting. This communal exchange of information wasn't always a smooth process, though. Just as today's social media can spread misinformation, so too could medieval tavern gossip be unreliable. You've probably heard the saying, "Don't believe everything you hear." And in the case of medieval tavern news, this was particularly true. While the tavern was a space of shared communication, it was also a space where personal biases, misunderstandings, and outright lies could infiltrate the conversation. Imagine hearing that a neighbouring village was planning a raid, or that a local lord had been slain, only to later find out it was just an exaggeration born from a drunken game of dice. But despite these risks, the tavern served an important role in the social structure of medieval society. It was where people went to get their news, where business deals were made, and where friendships were forged. Even the most dire of rumours could be a topic of discussion, uniting tavern-goers with shared curiosity. And as you take another sip of your drink, you realise that for all its rough edges and potential dangers, the tavern was an essential part of medieval life. It was more than just a place to drink. It was the centre of social life where people came together to laugh, fight, and most importantly, connect. As the night stretches on and you sip your drink, it's impossible to ignore the fundamental tension at play in the tavern, the ever-present tension between sacred and sinful. For as much as the tavern was a place of joy, camaraderie, and relaxation, it was also a place that was often in direct conflict with the prevailing religious and moral values of medieval society. Taverns, for all their social importance, were regarded with suspicion and disdain by the church. And in a deeply religious society where the church held significant sway, this conflict created a fascinating duality. Taverns were often viewed as places of sin, debauchery, and moral decay. To the church, they represented everything that was wrong with society: indulgence, drunkenness, and the breakdown of the social order. Alcohol itself was not inherently evil, but excessive drinking, the kind that happened in a tavern, was considered a vice, something that could lead people astray and keep them from living a virtuous life. Drinking in moderation was acceptable, but tavern drinking, that was a whole other issue. You see, medieval Christianity placed a heavy emphasis on self-discipline, repentance, and moral restraint. The tavern, however, was the antithesis of all these values. It was a place where people let their guards down, where they indulged in pleasures without concern for the consequences. And, of course, alcohol played a key role in this. The more someone drank, the more likely they were to fall into a state of moral unawareness. It was easy to see why the church would be wary of the tavern and its influence. In a time when spiritual salvation was paramount, a place where people gathered to drink, play games, and gossip seemed to be the perfect breeding ground for sin. The church's hostility toward the tavern wasn't limited to just the medieval period. It persisted for centuries. As religio, us leaders sought to restrict drinking and, by extension, the activities that occurred in taverns. But not all clerics viewed taverns with disdain. In fact, some saw them as a necessary evil, even a useful tool for social control. Taverns could, after all, be places of fellowship and socialization that helped keep the peace. Some clergy members argued that as long as the tavern was managed properly, it could serve as a place to promote moral behaviour, though this was a somewhat naive view. Others recognized the reality. Taverns were sometimes places of chaos, and no amount of spiritual rhetoric could change that. Tavern keepers were often caught in the middle of this tension. They had to navigate the delicate balance between running a business and dealing with the church's disapproval. While some tavern keepers were devout Christians, many found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to cater to the moral whims of the religious authorities while also ensuring that their tavern remained profitable. In some cases, tavern owners tried to appease the church by making their establishments more respectable, perhaps by installing crucifixes on the walls or hiring a priest to offer blessings before the first drink was served. But this never fully addressed the underlying issue. The tavern, at its core, was a place where people indulged in behaviors that were considered sinful, no matter how much you tried to sanitize the experience. Despite the church's negative view of taverns, they were still integral to medieval life. Without the tavern, many people wouldn't have had a place to socialize, unwind, and bond with their community. And while the church preached restraint and abstinence, many people turned to the tavern as a place to escape the rigid constraints of religious life. For some, it was a way to enjoy themselves without fear of judgment. For others, it was the only social outlet available to them. This tension between the sacred and the sinful in the tavern wasn't just about alcohol, it was about the very nature of human indulgence. Alcohol allowed people to momentarily forget the heavy weight of morality and religious doctrine, giving them a sense of freedom, a release from the constant pressure to behave virtuously. It allowed them to indulge in pleasures that were often suppressed in other parts of life, laughing too loudly, talking too freely, playing games with no higher purpose than to pass the time. The tavern was a place where the normal rules of behavior were momentarily suspended and people could let their hair down and enjoy life. But the church was ever watchful, and it wasn't long before efforts were made to regulate and control the tavern's influence on the population. One such effort was the imposition of restrictions on tavern hours. During certain religious festivals or periods of fasting, the church would issue decrees to limit drinking. These laws were intended to ensure that people adhered to the church's expectations for piety and moderation. In some areas, taverns were closed during important religious holidays, and those who defied these orders faced severe punishment. For the church, this wasn't just about alcohol, it was about maintaining control over the moral compass of society. Taverns, with their loose morals and carefree atmosphere, posed a direct challenge to that control. Yet for all the church's efforts, the tavern continued to thrive. The demands of medieval life were harsh, and the escape that the tavern provided was too valuable to ignore. People, after all, needed an outlet. The tension between religious authority and the tavern's role as a social hub was part of the wider clash between the sacred and secular forces in medieval society. The church, despite its best efforts, couldn't stamp out the tavern as a crucial part of the social fabric. It was a place of escape, relaxation, and camaraderie, qualities that couldn't easily be quelled by sermons or decrees. For the common folk, the tavern wasn't just a place to get drunk, it was a place where they could momentarily forget the harshness of their lives. And for the church, no matter how much they tried to control tavern culture, they could never fully erase its importance. It was a part of medieval life, for better or worse. As you sit back and watch the scene unfold around you, you realize that the tavern is both a sanctuary and a battleground. It is a space where social dynamics play out in real time, where power structures are both reinforced and challenged, and where the line between virtue and sin is constantly blurred. The tavern, for all its messiness, is an essential part of medieval society. Its role in the community may have been controversial, but it was undeniable, and as the night deepens, it becomes clear that the sacred and the sinful will always coexist within these walls, just as they do in the world outside. As the hours drag on, the air in the tavern thickens with more than just the smoke from the hearth. The room has grown quieter in some corners, but you can still hear the soft murmur of voices and the clink of mugs. It's easy to get lost in the dimly lit room, to feel like the boundaries of time and space blur as the evening unfolds. But amidst all the chatter and revelry, there's one thing that's always lurking in the background just beneath the surface: the importance of community in the tavern. In a world where isolation was the norm for most, the tavern was the place where bonds were forged, alliances were formed, and even feuds could be settled or deepened. Imagine a farmer who has spent hours toiling in the fields alone, a solitary life punctuated only by brief encounters with other workers or the occasional neighbour. After a long day where the only sounds were the wind in the crops and the distant calls of animals, stepping into the tavern was like entering a different world. No longer was he alone. Now he was surrounded by people who shared his burdens and joys, if only for a short while. The tavern became a sanctuary, a place where the isolation of rural life could be forgotten, if only for a few hours. For the tavern-goer, this sense of community was often the primary draw. The drink was a secondary concern to the social bonds that were formed over it. The simple act of drinking together, of sharing a table, of laughing and talking with others was deeply woven into the fabric of medieval society. In a world where life was harsh and unpredictable, where wars could break out without warning and diseases could wipe out entire villages, the tavern was one of the few places where a sense of normalcy and stability could be found. This communal aspect of the tavern wasn't limited to the sharing of drink and food. It extended to the very heart of medieval dynamics. Taverns were places where news was exchanged, secrets were shared, and relationships were negotiated. Business deals were struck over a mug of ale, and personal connections were made that could last a lifetime. The tavern served as the social glue for the community. It was a place where one could meet someone new, rekindle old friendships, or perhaps meet an adversary in the most unexpected of circumstances. Think of the local merchant who had just come in from a long journey across several villages with news of what was happening elsewhere. He steps into the tavern, orders a drink, and soon enough the room is filled with the sound of eager ears listening intently. People leaned in to hear the stories of distant lands, or perhaps news of some local scandal they might not have known about otherwise. The tavern was the perfect venue for such exchanges. It wasn't a place where you could keep secrets for long. News travelled fast, and the communal nature of the tavern ensured that everyone knew, or at least heard, the same stories. This was particularly crucial in a time when communication was often slow, and the only way to hear about the outside world was through travellers, merchants, or those who had the ear of someone important. On the flip side, though, the tavern's role as a space for gossip could also be a double-edged sword. Not everything shared was benign or neutral. Taverns were also where rumours and conspiracies could take root, where unverified claims and whispers about people's reputations spread like wildfire. It was here that political dissent or criticism of the ruling class could be heard, sometimes under the guise of idle chatter, other times as a rallying cry for rebellion. For the noble class, taverns were a hotbed of rumours, and it wasn't unusual for them to keep an eye on tavern-goers for signs of discontent or treachery. A casual comment overheard in the tavern could mean the difference between peace and unrest. Of course, this environment of secrecy and rumour wasn't just limited to larger political movements. It played out in everyday relationships as well. Take the common feuds that would crop up over petty slights, a dispute over land, an argument between neighbours, or even a disagreement over a business deal. It was in the tavern that these feuds could boil over. Tavern goers would often engage in heated debates, with alcohol serving as both a social lubricant and a catalyst for conflict. Words could quickly turn into insults, and insults could escalate into a physical confrontation. However, the tavern was also the place where conflicts could be settled, whether through a friendly game, a word of advice from a local elder, or a conciliatory drink. And let's not forget about the role of the women in this medieval tavern society. While it might seem like these places were largely male-dominated, women played an important, though often underappreciated role. In some taverns, women were the ones who ran the business, brewed the beer, or ensured that patrons were well taken care of. They were often the quiet backbone of the tavern, navigating the delicate balance of maintaining order while also engaging with the customers. While their roles were more subdued, women were also the keepers of many social functions in the tavern. They would act as mediators in disputes, keep the flow of conversation going, and even provide the emotional support needed during times of trouble. In some areas, women would also frequent the tavern for socializing and business purposes. It wasn't uncommon for women to meet their husbands or potential suitors here, engaging in conversations that could lead to marriage or business alliances. The tavern then became a sort of public space where the social fabric of the community was constantly being woven and rewoven. Men and women alike, regardless of status, interacted in ways that might not have been possible elsewhere in medieval society. While the tavern wasn't always a welcoming space for women in many regions, it provided an important avenue for them to engage in social and economic life outside the confines of the home. At its heart, the tavern was a space for connection, for shared experience. Whether you were there for the news, the drink, or the company, the tavern was the one place where you could be part of something larger than yourself. The sense of belonging, the camaraderie shared over a pint of ale or a glass of mead, is something that transcends time and place. In medieval times, it was the tavern that helped bind together the fragmented communities scattered across villages and towns. It was the anchor in a world where relationships and alliances were key to survival. As you sit back, you realize the enormity of the role that the tavern played in daily life. The community wasn't just built on the physical structure of homes or the local marketplace. It was built in places like this, in the conversations and interactions that took place over a drink. The medieval tavern wasn't just a place to drink. It was a place to belong, to connect, to argue, to celebrate, and sometimes to mourn. It was the social heart of the village, as essential to medieval life as any church or marketplace. In a world where survival often depended on knowing who you could trust, the tavern was where those bonds were formed, for better or worse. For some, it was a lifeline. For others, it was the site of conflict, rivalry, and scandal. But for everyone, it was the place where stories were written, not in the scrolls of the scholars or the halls of kings, but in the loud, smoky rooms of the local tavern. As the night drags on, you begin to notice the subtle shift in the tavern's energy. The revelry is still present, but there's a quiet undercurrent of something else. This place, despite its rowdiness and chaos, holds a certain gravitas. You can't quite put your finger on it, but it's clear that beyond the social interaction and occasional fights, there's something much deeper at work in these walls. The tavern, in many ways, wasn't just a place for the community to come together. It was also a place of secrets, a space where people could escape from the watchful eyes of the world and engage in dealings that wouldn't be acceptable in the light of day. Historically, taverns were places where both legitimate and illicit transactions took place. While business deals were struck and news was exchanged, so were other far more dangerous dealings. The tavern was a space where the rules of society could be bent, sometimes broken altogether. There were a variety of illegal activities that flourished in the shadows of medieval taverns. Smuggling was one of the most common. Taverns that were located near major trade routes or close to ports were prime locations for the clandestine exchange of goods. These taverns, often managed by individuals with dubious backgrounds, became hotbeds of criminal activity. Merchants and smugglers would meet in these taverns to exchange goods that were forbidden or too heavily taxed by the authorities. Whether it was the latest contraband or stolen goods, these items were often hidden in the nooks and crannies of the tavern, waiting to be passed on to their next destination. You might find an innkeeper serving drinks by day and acting as a secretive fence by night, quietly aiding in the illicit activities while turning a blind eye to the law. For many tavern owners, the profits from these secret dealings were just as important, if not more so, and the legitimate income from selling ale and mead. The idea of the tavern as a hub for underworld activity wasn't restricted to smuggling. Taverns were also frequently the sites of organized crime. Gangs and criminal groups often used taverns as places to meet, exchange information, and plan their next moves. The tavern keeper, depending on their morals, might turn a blind eye to these dealings or even actively participate in them. They were often the ones who facilitated these meetings, ensuring that both the criminals and the law-abiding citizens were kept happy, or at least unaware of the illegal activities happening under their noses. Even beyond the underworld, taverns were places where personal vendettas could be played out. If there was a dispute between two townsfolk, whether over a piece of land or a failed business venture, the tavern was often where the first blow would be struck. Alcohol fueled aggression, and a simple disagreement could escalate into a physical confrontation with far-reaching consequences. It's not hard to imagine how tensions could boil over in a space as charged as this. With alcohol lowering inhibitions and heightening emotions, there was little to stop tempers from flaring. And for some, the tavern wasn't just about the camaraderie and the drinks, it was about asserting power. If you were a man of power or wealth, you could walk into a tavern and demand attention, knowing that your presence alone would shift the dynamic. For those with a vendetta or score to settle, the tavern provided a venue to do so, free from the constraints of the outside world's expectations. But the tavern wasn't all about power plays and clandestine dealings. There was a romanticism to these shady dealings too, a kind of allure that drew certain types of individuals to the tavern in search of excitement, opportunity, and escape. Some taverns even became famous for the illicit activities that occurred within their walls. These notorious taverns attracted visitors from far and wide, drawn not just by the promise of drink, but by the darker allure of the spaces where secrecy and intrigue thrived. You might think of the tavern as a space solely for relaxation, but when you dig deeper, you see that it was also a place of personal transformation. For better or worse, tavern-goers weren't just seeking entertainment, they were seeking something else entirely. The tavern allowed people to become someone else, even if only for a short while. It was a place where people could act out of character, shed their social roles, and embrace a different side of themselves. They could be bolder, braver, or more reckless than they might be in the light of day. For some, the tavern was a place of reinvention. If you were a man who had been wronged, the tavern allowed you to find a moment of reprieve from the crushing weight of your circumstances. Here, you could start fresh, you could fight for your honor, or even try to escape your past. The tavern allowed people to assume a new identity, to reinvent themselves through their actions and relationships with others. These reinventions didn't always end well, but for many, the tavern was a space where they could push the boundaries of their lives, shedding their daily struggles and embracing a more exciting, albeit dangerous, life. And let's not forget about the tavern songs, the stories that were sung, the laughter that erupted at the right moment, the shanties that built camaraderie among strangers. Despite all the dark dealings, jeers and potential violence, there was always an underlying sense of joy to the tavern. Even in its most chaotic moments, there was something undeniably human about it. People didn't just drink and fight, they also laughed. they danced, they sang, they connected. The tavern was a space where human emotion could be expressed without the constraints of the outside world. You might be wondering, as you sit back and observe, how people manage to navigate this world of tension, intrigue, and excitement. How did they continue to show up night after night, despite the underlying dangers that brewed just beneath the surface? The answer is simple: community. The tavern was not only a place of escape, it was a place of belonging. It was a place where you could feel part of something larger than yourself, where you could be accepted, if only for a few hours. In a harsh, unpredictable world, the tavern offered a brief respite from the pressures of daily life, a place where your worries could be left at the door, if only temporarily. And so, as the night deepens, the flickering candlelight casts long shadows, and you begin to understand that the tavern is more than just a building with walls. It's a living, breathing part of the medieval world. It's a place where human nature is both revealed and concealed, where secrets are shared, alliances are formed, and reputations are made and broken. In this world of uncertainty and danger, the tavern remains a constant, a space where the story of the people is told, through drink, through laughter, through silence, and yes, through the occasional fight. It's not just a tavern, it's a reflection of the world outside. The tavern is a microcosm of life itself, with all its beauty, brutality, hope, and despair packed into a single space. The people who walk through its doors may be different, but inside they share the same human condition: in connection, seeking purpose, seeking escape. And as you sit in the warmth of this medieval tavern, you realize that what you're experiencing is more than just a drink in hand and a good story. You're experiencing the heart of medieval society, pulsing with life, imperfection, and the raw reality of existence. And when the night ends and the tavern doors close behind you, it's clear: the story of the tavern is never truly finished. It continues on in the hearts and minds of those who pass through its walls. The hours are growing late now, and the tavern is beginning to empty. Some patrons have staggered out into the cool night air, leaving behind empty mugs, unspoken words, and the faint echoes of their laughter. The once bustling room, filled with the noise of camaraderie, has now quieted to a hushed murmur. But even in the silence, there's a sense of lingering presence. The echoes of the past and the ghosts of every conversation, every song, every fight that unfolded within these walls. The tavern's legacy isn't just in its physical structure, it's in the stories it's held, stories that will continue to reverberate long after the candles burn out and the last mug is cleaned. The closing hours of the tavern offer a unique perspective. For most people, a tavern visit was the beginning or the middle of the night. It was the time for celebration, revelry, or simple socializing. But as the night winds down and the remaining patrons trickle out, the tavern transforms. It's no longer a lively social hub. It's a place of reflection, of quiet, of finality. Everything that has transpired throughout the evening, from the laughter to the brawls, now hangs in the air like smoke that's only just begun to dissipate. You watch as the last few patrons leave, tipping their hats or giving the tavern keeper a nod of thanks. You're alone now, or at least it feels that way. The fire in the hearth is down to embers, casting long shadows on the walls. The worn wooden tables, which had borne witness to all manner of laughter and discord, now sit still, waiting for the next night's crowd. Even the tavern keeper is more subdued now, cleaning the mugs, wiping down counters, preparing for the inevitable cycle to repeat the next evening. There's something poignant about these moments of stillness, the calm after the storm of a busy night. The tavern, despite all the chaos it housed, was always ready to open its doors the next day, welcoming new and familiar faces alike. It's in these quiet hours that the tavern seems to take on a life of its own, as if it has become a part of the very soul of the town or village. It's not just a building, it's a living, breathing entity. Every bruise on the wood, every crack in the wall tells the story of countless nights of shared human experience. The tavern has been here, in this space, for years, perhaps even centuries. It's seen countless people come and go, witnessed triumphs and tragedies, and held the weight of time within its walls. The rituals of the tavern are as much a part of its story as the drinks it serves. Every time the door swings open and a new face enters, it's as though the same story is being told again and again with new players in the cast. The patron who enters tonight might not know it, but they're part of a long tradition that stretches back to the earliest days of medieval society. Every interaction in the tavern, whether it's a game, a conversation, or a fight, adds a new chapter to its ever-evolving history. As the tavern keeper finishes his work and prepares for rest, there's a moment of quiet contemplation. In the silence, you realize that the tavern isn't just a place for social interaction, it's a repository of human stories. Every single person who has crossed the threshold of that door has added something to the collective memory of the space. It's a place where lives intersect, where paths cross in the most unexpected ways. The tavern serves as a reminder that people are always connected, whether they realize it or not. For the tavern keeper, this final hour is a time of reflection too. They are the keepers of the stories, the ones who silently observe the comings and goings of the patrons. They've seen it all, the highs, the lows, the drunken laughter, the tears, the fights and the alliances. They are the silent historians of the tavern, aware of the unspoken dramas that unfold in every corner. The tavern keeper knows the regulars, the newcomers, the troublemakers and the dreamers. In many ways, they're more attuned to the pulse of the community than anyone else. It's a role that comes with responsibility, as they serve not just drinks, but a sense of continuity, of connection. But while the tavern keeper may know the stories of those who frequent the tavern, the stories that stay hidden are perhaps the most intriguing. The tavern has a way of drawing people into its web, but it also keeps its secrets. There are those who visit the tavern with a purpose, with a hidden agenda, and their stories are often concealed in plain sight. Whether it's the merchant selling goods under the table or the politician making covert deals, the tavern serves as the perfect backdrop for these hidden plots. In some ways, the tavern functions as a social stage where personal motives, political maneuvering, and hidden alliances unfold in subtle ways. What's striking about the tavern, though, is the way it remains unchanged through the centuries. The role it plays in society, the rituals that take place within its walls, and the characters that pass through its doors are all the same. Despite the countless transformations that society undergoes, shifting politics, economic crises, wars and technological revolutions, the tavern remains. People continue to come together in this space to share a drink, to laugh, to argue, to dance, to cry. It's the one constant, the anchor in a world that's always changing. The tavern may close for the night, but it's always waiting to open its doors again, ready for the next round of stories to unfold. As you sit in the final silence of the night, you can almost hear the echoes of every moment that has passed within these walls. The laughter, the music, the clinking of mugs, these are the sounds that linger in the air even after everyone has left. The tavern doesn't just exist in the present, it exists in memory. The moments, the conversations, the interactions, they live on, embedded in the very fabric of the space. It's a reminder that for all the chaos and unpredictability, the tavern remains a testament to the enduring human need for connection. As you leave the tavern behind, stepping out into the cool night air, you can almost hear the soft murmur of the next night's crowd already calling you back. The stories will continue, as they always have. And so, the cycle of the tavern, with its endless possibilities for connection, laughter, and intrigue, will go on. The tavern may be empty for now, but the stories it holds will never truly fade. As you step outside, the cool night air hits you, a stark contrast to the warmth and smoke of the tavern. The sounds of the tavern fade behind you, but something lingers, almost like a whisper, a pull that keeps you tethered to the space you've just left. It's easy to forget that the tavern is more than just a place to drink. It's more than the games, the fights, and the laughter. It's a cultural institution, one that has shaped not just the lives of those who frequented it, but also the wider history of medieval society. What's striking about the medieval tavern is that for all its simplicity, it's a place where people's destinies have been shaped, where decisions, sometimes of great consequence, have been made over mugs of ale or cups of mead. This was a space where kings, lords, and commoners all shared a similar fate, even if only for a brief moment. The tavern was a place where society's power structures could be momentarily suspended, and the equilibrium could shift in surprising and even unpredictable ways. Let's step back for a second. You've seen the tavern as a place of community, a place of rebellion and retreat, a haven for gossip and intrigue. But there was also another side to it, a side that was about survival. You see, the medieval tavern wasn't just a space of recreation, it was a crucial part of the economy, and for many, it served as a place of transaction, even beyond the social bonds formed there. It was the economic lifeblood of a village or town, a place where merchants could find buyers, peasants could barter labour, and travellers could sell exotic goods or services. In these spaces, the exchange wasn't always in money. Often it was in promises or favours, sometimes invisible, but equally as valuable as coin. A handshake in a tavern could seal the fate of entire families, businesses, or even a political campaign. Consider the merchant who closed a deal over his third mug of ale, or the soldier who recruited new members for a band of mercenaries while sharing tales of their battles. The tavern was a space where the pulse of society beat faster. Decisions were made, allegiances were formed, and lives were changed. What makes the tavern so intriguing, so essential, is that everyone interacted within the same space. A peasant might be drinking alongside a nobleman, sharing a laugh over a game of dice, or maybe arguing over a piece of land. For those moments, social class was secondary to the shared human experience of drinking, talking, and making deals. Yes, the classes remained separate in the grander scheme of things, but the tavern allowed for this brief, momentary equality. Here, wealth, title, and birthright could be put aside, and everyone was just trying to have a good time or get through the next hardship. It's hard to ignore the weight of history in such a space. The medieval tavern was a testament to the resilience of people, to the ways they managed to connect with each other despite the overwhelming challenges they faced. After all, medieval life was brutal in many ways. Famines, plagues, constant wars, and brutal political power struggles. And yet, in the tavern, people could take a breath. They could forget about the hardship for a while and enjoy simple pleasures. Alcohol and company, after all, are both powerful things. But this sense of shared humanity didn't erase the darker elements of tavern life. For all the camaraderie, the shared stories, and the joy of a good drink, taverns were often places where conflict could boil over, whether it was personal feuds, political tension, or the ever-present threat of rebellion. The tavern, in its chaotic beauty, was a reflection of medieval society at its most raw, both fragile and unyielding. Violence could erupt in an instant, as you saw in the brawls, fueled by both alcohol and the primal desire to settle differences. Yet, even in those moments of aggression, the tavern had a way of absorbing that chaos and continuing on night after night. There's also the fascinating role the tavern played in shaping memory. The medieval tavern wasn't just a place of transitory interaction, it was a space of cultural continuity. Over time, tavern stories became legendary. Think of the famous tavern tales passed from one generation to the next. The man who challenged the king to a drinking contest. The innkeeper who became the secret source of intelligence during a war. The endless games of dice, where fate seemed to change with every roll. The tavern, for all its transient nature, was also a permanent marker in the folklore of medieval life. And this folklore, this shared history, is often how we remember the tavern today. The great tavern tales are handed down as stories of adventure, mischief, and the folly of humankind. But beneath these stories lies a profound truth. The tavern was where life happened. And it wasn't just the great and famous moments that mattered. It was the small ones too, the fleeting conversations, the quiet laughter, the moments of camaraderie that held the fabric of the community together. The tavern may have served as a place of escapism for some, but for many it was simply the place where life unfolded, and in those moments of shared humanity, there was something powerful. Even the most unlikely of connections could be made over a drink, even in the most dangerous of places. People of all walks of life found a form of unity in the tavern, at least for the time being. For all its flaws, its chaos, and its shadowy corners, the tavern was the place where social interaction happened. It was the place where the lines between stranger and neighbour were blurred, and where everyone, for a brief moment, had the same goal: to escape, to connect, to be human. And as you look around at the final empty mug in your hand, you realise just how much the medieval tavern shaped the lives of those who walked through its doors. It wasn't simply a place to get drunk, to fight, or to gossip. It was a space that held life itself. The tavern, in all its wild, unpredictable glory, became more than just a meeting place. It was a living, breathing institution that shaped relationships, moulded history, and even impacted the course of wars, politics, and the lives of everyday people. Tonight, as you prepare to leave, the echo of the tavern's story still lingers with you. You may have just experienced a glimpse into its world, a world where the sacred met the sinful, where life and death were often discussed in the same breath, where the fate of many was sealed with nothing more than a handshake over a mug of ale. The tavern was more than just a place. It was the place that gave people a brief escape from the grind of life, the pain, the struggles, and the stories of humanity that would otherwise go untold. As you leave behind the now empty tavern, you can almost hear the muffled sound of laughter, the clink of mugs, and the murmur of conversation still echoing in your mind. The story of the tavern is never truly over, and as it waits for its next visitors, the people who've passed through its doors will forever be intertwined in its history. As you step back into the quiet of the night, away from the tavern's flickering warmth, the world around you feels eerily still. The bustle of the tavern seems to be fading, but there's something in the air, a lingering sense of continuity, a sense that the stories you've heard tonight, the drinks you've shared, and the people you've encountered are all a part of something much larger than the space you just left. You're not just walking away from the tavern, you're walking away from centuries of history, of cultural rituals, of human behavior, all of which were encapsulated in that one small space. The medieval tavern was not only a physical location, it was a symbol, a representation of how humanity comes together in times of hardship, celebration, and everything in between. And as you walk through the cool night air, it's impossible not to reflect on the way taverns were the stage for life's rawest moments. They were places of release, of transformation, of shared experiences. But more than that, they were the spaces where the undercurrents of society came into focus. When you think about it, the tavern wasn't just about community and escape. It was also about power. the subtle and sometimes overt dynamics that shaped the way medieval people interacted. Whether it was the tavern keeper who held sway over the room, the local merchant who had more influence than the nobleman, or the stranger who came into town and changed everything, the tavern was always a space where power was negotiated. It was a place where people tested their boundaries, where alliances were made, and where people were given a platform to speak their truths, sometimes at great risk. For instance, consider the travelers who came into town with news from the outside world. Their words carried weight, not just because they were sharing information, but because of the power they wielded by being thieves, bearers of news. News could change the political landscape, could stir uprisings or calm the masses. A single piece of information shared in a tavern could shift the course of a community's future. The tavern wasn't just a place for local gossip. It was a space where the outside world could be brought in, sometimes with explosive consequences. As you walk away from the tavern, you can almost hear the voices of the past, the way a medieval town might have buzzed with rumors or shrunk in fear at a piece of news that arrived unexpectedly. Taverns were places of both opportunity and risk. They were breeding grounds for rebellion, places where the power dynamics of the day played out in real time. It wasn't just about drinking or socializing, it was about creating the possibility of something greater, something that could change the course of history, all in the time it took to finish a drink. There were also darker elements to the tavern's power. Sometimes those who occupied the tavern's shadowy corners weren't simply seeking a good time, they were seeking control or to manipulate the system. The tavern could serve as a place where plots were hatched, where dangerous alliances were formed. And while many tavern-goers sought solace in a drink, others came looking for leverage, using their time in the tavern as a stepping stone to greater power or influence. These people weren't just visitors, they were the architects of change, whether for good or ill. In many ways, the tavern mirrored the larger world's complex power structures, a microcosm of the very forces that shaped society outside. However, despite the presence of these darker forces, the tavern also remained a place of hope. For all the tensions, the power plays, and the behind-the-scenes dealings, it was still a place where people sought human connection. It was a place where you could sit with a stranger, share a drink, and for a brief moment experience the humane side of life. This duality is what makes the tavern such an essential part of medieval life. It wasn't just a space of conflict, it was a space where people could find solidarity, where a quiet moment of peace could be shared between two people who had nothing else in common. The tavern's ability to serve as both a site of social connection and cultural conflict is what made it such a crucial institution, and this duality was felt by every person who walked through its doors. For some, it was a temporary escape from the weight of everyday life. For others, it was a place to forge relationships, form allegiances, and even change the course of their own futures. The medieval tavern, in all its complexity, wasn't just a place of revelry, it was a dynamic space that held the pulse of society. It was a place where the intimate and the monumental met, a place where stories and fates were intertwined. For those who came to the tavern seeking camaraderie, a brief respite from their troubles, they found not just solace in a mug of ale, but the enduring human spirit. It was here, amidst the noise and chaos, that people learned to survive, to fight, to love, and to connect. And it's in these tavern stories that we find a reflection of ourselves, the desire to be seen, to be heard, and to be part of something greater than ourselves. As you reflect on the night and the fading sounds of the tavern, you realize that you haven't just learned about the past, you've learned something about human nature, about the way people have always sought connection, power, and belonging, no matter the time or place. The tavern may have been just a building, but it was the soul of the community, beating in time with the flow of the alcohol, the rhythms of laughter, and the eternal need for people to come together, if only for a few fleeting hours. And even though the tavern doors have closed for the night, the stories it held will live on, echoing in the memories of those who experienced it. For the tavern may be gone when you walk away, but its influence is eternal. The tavern lives in the way people continue to gather, to share, to drink, and to become part of something bigger than themselves. As the cool night air brushes against your skin and you walk through the quiet streets, your thoughts continue to linger on the tavern. You've experienced its atmosphere, felt its pulse, and witnessed its complex web of social, political, and human dynamics. But as you step further away, you can't help but wonder, how did the tavern evolve over time, and how did it influence the future of drinking culture and social spaces? While the medieval tavern is firmly rooted in the past, its legacy can still be felt in today's pubs, bars, and social spaces. It wasn't just a place of drinking, it was a place of community, and its importance was woven into the fabric of society. The medieval tavern wasn't just an afterthought for the weary traveller. It was a central institution. For centuries, it was where connections were made, where people could seek both escape and enlightenment, and where social order, however chaotic, was maintained. In a world without modern technology, these establishments were often the only place where people could truly connect beyond their immediate family or professional circle. In many ways, the medieval tavern laid the groundwork for what we see today in modern drinking culture. While today's bars may be slicker, with a more refined atmosphere and strict regulations, the heart of what we seek in these spaces is not so different from what people longed for centuries ago: to connect with others, to share stories, and to leave the weight of the outside world behind for a brief moment. But what does that look like now, compared to how it once was? How has the tavern evolved? In the early days, the tavern wasn't just a place for casual drinking, it was where politics could be discussed, where rumours spread faster than in any royal court, and where deals were made that affected both the local and international landscape. Taverns in medieval Europe often hosted political debates, discussions about royal decrees, and sometimes the planning of uprisings or revolts. The social dynamics within these spaces were remarkably similar to today's political pub discussions, but back then the stakes could be far higher. You start to realize that the tavern's role as a political space was one of its most defining features. Political leaders, religious figures, and rebels alike understood that the tavern was where the pulse of the people could be felt. When kings sought to maintain control, they'd often turn to tavern keepers and local authorities to manage unrest. A tavern's atmosphere, rife with rumour and gossip, could turn into an intellectual battlefield where the ideological struggles of the time were played out under the cover of ale-fueled conversations. It was a space where ideas were not only exchanged but tested, where a conversation could spiral into a movement, a spark for change. Even after the medieval period passed, the tavern continued to function as a hub for social change. As society moved into the Renaissance and beyond, the tavern's political influence waned in some places but persisted in others. The idea of the local tavern as a microcosm of society continued in towns and villages across Europe. This sense of community within tavern walls helped shape the future of public discourse, offering a space for the exchange of ideas, whether it was the philosopher drinking with the merchant or the poet sharing a song with the traveller. Yet, despite its continued social relevance, the tavern's darker side remained present, even as drinking culture evolved. The risks of overindulgence and violence, which were always a part of the tavern experience, continued to surface in various forms, but the arrival of more formalized bars and pubs in the 17th and 18th centuries slowly began to shift the focus. Now, tavern-goers were less likely to engage in the kinds of brawls or political conversations that dominated medieval times. The more modern concept of the pub was born, less focused on social upheaval, more focused on relaxation and socialization in a structured environment. Despite these changes, the idea of the tavern persisted. In a world of modern connectivity, with technology drawing people into virtual spaces instead of physical ones, the tavern is a reminder of the human need for connection. Today's bars and pubs have become places not just for relaxation, but for networking and even healing. We go to the pub not just to drink, but to reconnect with old friends, to bond with strangers over shared experiences, to ease our minds after a long day, and in some cases to push the boundaries of conversation just as medieval tavern-goers did. But what's most interesting is that the spirit of the medieval tavern still lives on in our drinking culture. The tavern was a place of social equalization, where status could be momentarily disregarded in favor of a shared human experience. It was a place where you could bond over a drink and where class distinctions faded, if only for the evening. This egalitarian ethos continues in many modern establishments where strangers meet as equals to share a drink or a conversation. And yet, even in our modern world, there remains a quiet tension that mirrors the tension of medieval taverns. The tension between public and private life, between control and chaos, between the structure of society and the liberation found in moments of collective escape. Looking back, you see that the medieval tavern was a transitional space, a space where personal history, social dynamics, and political change collided. It was where you came to lose yourself, but also where you came to find yourself. Just as the night deepens and the tavern empties, the moments of connection and the conversations shared there will never fade. They are imprinted on the very fabric of history. As you walk further into the night, you begin to understand that the tavern was more than a place. It was a cultural engine, shaping the way people interacted, the way ideas were exchanged, and the way history itself unfolded. It's not just a memory of a long-gone past, it's a living, breathing part of the collective human experience. And as long as people continue to gather, to share stories over drinks, the spirit of the tavern will continue to thrive. The medieval tavern may be gone, but its legacy remains, quietly shaping the way we connect with each other today. As you walk farther into the night, your thoughts are heavy with the weight of what you've just learned. The medieval tavern wasn't merely a space for fleeting entertainment. It was a dynamic, living entity. It was more than a place to quench thirst. It was a social crucible where bonds were forged, lives were changed, and society's deepest structures were both reinforced and challenged. The tavern allowed people to engage with each other on a level that was often impossible elsewhere in life. This was the real power of the tavern, not in the drink, but in the shared human experience it provided. But it wasn't just the tavern's role in social life that made it so remarkable. It was its lasting legacy on human history and how those stories continue to shape us today. You begin to realize that the medieval tavern was not only crucial to the social landscape, but also to the cultural identity of the medieval world. It was a space where culture was passed down from generation to generation. Songs were sung, stories were shared, jokes were told, and in doing so, the tavern became the repository of a shared memory. Much of medieval folklore and the oral traditions we still hold dear today were passed through the tavern doors. Stories of legendary heroes, gods, and monsters weren't just whispered in royal courts or by wandering minstrels, they were alive in the tavern. Whether through the animated conversations of travellers or the rhyming songs of bards, the tavern ensured that traditions lived on, shaping the collective psyche of the people. This oral culture wasn't only about passing on tales of kings and heroes, though. Many tavern-goers found themselves living out their own stories in the way that small-town legends or family histories were spun at a local table. You might have heard the story of a man who drank too much and won a contest, or the tale of an infamous Taverns in Brawl that turned into a local myth. These personal anecdotes, passed down from one generation to the next, were as much a part of the tavern's culture as the historical events themselves. The tavern was a place where stories took root, bloomed and evolved in the mouths of those who lived them. Yet there was also the element of secrecy that gave the tavern a complex nature. For all the connection and camaraderie, there was also a darker side to this space. It was within these walls that the most intimate or dangerous of secrets could be whispered. While rumours and idle gossip were rampant, the tavern also played host to darker, clandestine dealings. The whispering of lovers or conspirators, the quiet meetings of spies or revolutionaries, these were also part of the tavern's function. For the medieval tavern, like all places of human congregation, was a space of duality, a place of connection, and yet sometimes a place of corruption. The idea of the tavern as a place for secret meetings or even illegal dealings isn't as strange as it might seem. Throughout history, places where people gathered naturally became spaces for information exchange and, at times, conspiracy. It was in these unguarded communal settings that alliances could be made and broken, that plans of rebellion were whispered over a glass of wine, and that power struggles were plotted in the corners where no one else could hear. Just as taverns were spaces where stories of rebellion were shared openly, they were also places where rebellion itself could be planned in the quiet shadows. Yet, at the heart of it all, there was a unique contradiction. The tavern was a space of both freedom and control. Yes, it was a place where people came to break free from the rules and the rigidity of their daily lives. But it was also a space where the authority of the tavern keeper, the gossip of the people, and the unwritten social norms still held sway. People came to the tavern to escape their reality, yet they did so within the very structure that shaped that reality. They were free, but only to a degree. The tavern was a release valve for all that was repressed, yet the very act of entering the tavern meant that people were, to some degree, submitting to the unspoken rules of that space. And while this balance between freedom and structure played out in every medieval tavern, it also reflects the larger human experience. We live in a world where we crave both connection and rebellion, where we yearn for freedom, but also seek the comfort of belonging. The tavern, as an institution, reflects these contradictory desires. It provided an outlet for people's frustrations, a space to step outside the boundaries of their lives. But it also served as a microcosm of the societal structures from which people were trying to escape. What's even more fascinating is that this duality persists today. While our modern bars and pubs may no longer be home to political revolutions or secret conspiracies, they still function as places where people gather to break free from the constraints of their daily lives. People go to bars to let off steam, to engage in conversation, to escape. And yet, even in our modern establishments, social norms are present, whether it's the expectations around tipping, ordering drinks, or how people interact with one another. The spaces we frequent today still carry with them the traces of that medieval tavern structure. What is it about the rituals of the tavern that still resonates with us? The way we greet the bartender, the act of ordering a drink, the shared moment of connection between strangers, all of these elements continue to serve the same purpose as they did centuries ago. The ritual of gathering for a drink, the communal nature of sharing in something simple like a beverage, brings people together in a way that few other things can. And it's this shared ritual that gives the tavern and its modern counterparts such enduring significance. You realise that the rituals of the tavern are as much a part of its cultural legacy as the stories and songs that were passed from one person to another. Whether it's the unspoken rules of the drink, the quiet hum of the crowd, or the camaraderie that forms in the most unlikely places, the tavern is a constant in the human experience. It may have changed in form, but its essence remains unchanged. Even as you leave behind the memory of the medieval tavern, you understand that it has shaped you too. You've lived through a brief chapter in its long history, a chapter of laughter, camaraderie, and reflection. You might be stepping away from the tavern, but in a way the tavern never truly leaves you. It exists now in your memory, in the stories you carry with you, in the moments of connection you've experienced, and in the way you'll carry those moments into your next gathering. The medieval tavern, with its chaos and calm, its joy and its secrets, continues to live on, inside all of us, in the way we connect, drink, laugh, and even rebel. It's more than a place, it's part of who we are. The night stretches on, and as you wander further away from the tavern, your thoughts begin to drift. The feeling of leaving behind such a deeply ingrained part of history is strange. It's almost like you've stepped out of one world and into another. The tavern is now behind you, its doors locked for the night, its walls still carrying the echoes of laughter, argument, and celebration. Yet its spirit lingers, as it always does, in the memories of the people who passed through its doors. The tavern was more than a mere drinking establishment. It was a living testament to the resilience of humanity, a symbol of how people, despite everything, always find a way to connect. As you walk through the streets, the modern world around you seems to fade into the background. You begin to realize that the tavern wasn't simply a physical structure, it was a space of transformation. It shaped people, relationships, and the course of events in ways that we often overlook today. This was where people could reinvent themselves, put on a mask, and become whoever they needed to be for a moment. It was here, in the chaos of spilled drinks and rowdy laughter, that you could often find the deepest moments of honesty. In the tavern, people were, for a fleeting moment, freed from their normal roles. It didn't matter if you were a lord or a peasant. Once you stepped inside, you were part of the same world. That ability to temporarily escape the pressures of society was a rare and precious thing. In the medieval world, where your birth and status determined so much about your life, the tavern provided a level playing field. It was one of the few places where the rigid social classes could be bridged, where interactions were based on the present moment and not the weight of societal expectations. In this way, the tavern became an essential part of medieval society's emotional release valve. After a long day of hard labor, heavy political decisions, or the constant strain of surviving in a world plagued by wars and disease, the tavern was where you could let it all go. For some, it was the only chance they had to step away from the grind of their lives, if only for a few hours. It didn't matter if the conversation turned into a heated debate, or if the night ended with a fight. It was still a space where raw, untamed emotion was welcomed. But let's not forget the tavern's more subtle role in shaping society. The tavern was also the birthplace of political discourse, even if that discourse was informal and filled with rumor. It was in these spaces that people learned the contours of political life, even if they didn't realize it. Tavern conversations weren't just idle chatter. The whispers about the king's latest decree or rumors of a potential rebellion weren't just stories. They were the heartbeat of political engagement. They were the sparks that would eventually set the fire of rebellion, ignite the flames of revolution, or influence the decisions of those in power. The tavern was in many ways the unofficial parliament of the people. But these discussions weren't always about big, world-changing events. Sometimes the conversations were about the more mundane aspects of life. A farmer could sit next to a merchant and discuss the price of grain. A craftsman could exchange gossip with a passing traveller. These seemingly trivial exchanges were the building blocks of the social fabric. They were how people stayed connected, how they understood the world, and how they navigated their own place in it. As you walk through the streets, you realize that the tavern wasn't just about escape or momentary equality. It was also about learning. In the tavern, people learned how to coexist. They learned how to negotiate, how to speak, how to listen. These weren't just skills for business, they were the skills of survival. For many, the tavern wasn't just a place to have a drink. It was a place where you learned how to navigate the complexities of medieval life. It was here that social norms were not only practiced but sometimes reshaped. And it's at this moment that you realize that the tavern was alive in a way that modern spaces can rarely replicate. There was a vibrancy to the medieval tavern, a constant pulse that reflected the struggles and triumphs of the people who filled it. Unlike the sterile, controlled environments of modern spaces, the tavern was messy, unpredictable, and full of life. It was raw, and that rawness gave it power. In many ways, this was the essence of the tavern. It was a place where nothing was off limits. Ideas, political discourse, personal grievances, dreams, fears, all of it could be found in the clink of a glass or the sound of a raised voice. The tavern may have been physically confined to a small, smoky room, but in its walls, the scope of human experience was vast. As the night continues, your thoughts turn back to the people you encountered in the tavern. Who were they really? What brought them there? And what did they leave with? Perhaps that's the most fascinating part of the tavern's legacy. It's a place of passage. People came to the tavern for many reasons: to escape their responsibilities, to seek solace, to forget, to be heard. Some left with their problems solved, some left with even more than they bargained for, and some perhaps left never to return. But the stories they left behind, the interactions, the fights, the laughter, all of that became a part of the tavern's history. And so the tavern story continues. It's not just the space, the drinks, or the games that make it significant. It's the way it serves as a reflection of humanity itself. It was a place where people could push their boundaries, confront their own limitations, and connect with others in ways they never could have imagined. It wasn't just about the drink, it was about the experience, the sense of belonging to something larger than oneself. As you look around, the world feels a little different now. You can almost feel the weight of history pressing down, not just on the tavern itself, but on the social dynamics that continue to shape the world today. The medieval tavern may be long gone, but its influence endures in the places where people gather to share a drink, tell a story, or seek comfort. The tavern is not just part of history, it's part of the human experience, one that transcends time and place. The tavern may have been chaotic, but it was also beautiful. In all of its noise and disorder, it held a deep truth that humanity, for all its flaws, always finds a way to connect, to build, to share. And the tavern was where that connection was made real, in laughter, in pain, and in the very real stories that people carried with them when they left. As you walk away, you realize that the tavern lives on, not just in history, but in you, in the way we all continue to seek connection in the most unlikely places. The chill of the night air feels refreshing now as you continue walking through the quiet streets. The echoes of the tavern still seem to hum in your ears like a lingering song whose notes remain in your mind, even as the world around you grows stiller. The tavern is behind you. But in many ways, the night you've just lived through isn't over. It's only just beginning to sink in. What you've experienced in that space, in that raw and bustling room, wasn't just a lesson in the past. It's a profound reflection of the human condition that continues to resonate today. The tavern was never just about the drinks or the games. It was a place where people came to be seen, to assert themselves, and to reinvent themselves, if only for the night. It was a place where people could embrace the complexities of their identities, whether they were noble or peasant, warrior or merchant, wanderer or local, within a society that often demanded rigid roles and expectations. The freedom that the tavern offered was powerful. It allowed for the possibility of change, of starting over, of forging connections, and in some cases of discovering something new about oneself or the world around you. In a world where survival was often determined by lineage or social class, the tavern was the one place where social barriers were temporarily suspended. You could be a farmer from a small village, yet sit across from a knight in shining armor and have an equal say in the conversation, if only for a brief moment. This kind of equality was rare, especially in medieval times, when rigid social hierarchies governed much of life. But within the tavern's walls, people from all walks of life came together, united by a shared need to belong, to be part of something larger, to connect. And what's truly remarkable is that this communal aspect wasn't simply about drink or games, it was about human interaction, and the way that human stories, desires and struggles were expressed through the lens of the tavern. For some, it was a place of joy and light-heartedness. For others, it was a sanctuary from the weight of the world. For those engaged in darker activities, it was a place of secrecy and power games. But across the spectrum, every person who entered the tavern brought something with them, whether it was a longing for connection, a secret to share, a problem to escape, or an agenda to push. The tavern became the stage where these individual stories played out. What really stands out, however, is the fact that the tavern wasn't just an escape, it was a place of creation. It's within these walls that many of the great movements of history found their beginnings, the debates that sparked revolutions, the ideas that eventually turned into intellectual movements, the revolts that tore apart kingdoms. You might not think of it this way, but the tavern was a laboratory for social change, for the mixing of ideas, experiences, and ambitions. It was here that people, both the famous and the unknown, could turn their deepest discontent into something tangible, whether that meant a political shift, a new business venture, or a piece of art. The tavern wasn't just a passive venue. It was active, always pulsating with the potential for new ideas, new beginnings, and new futures. It's also remarkable that for all its rowdy nature, the tavern provided a unique form of education. In these spaces, learning didn't happen through books or formal institutions. It happened through the act of living, through the exchange of stories and the process of engagement. The tavern was a place where you learned not only about the world, but also about human nature, about the complexities of politics, power, and survival. It was through these interactions, whether casual chats about the weather or passion, late debates about the price of grain, that people absorbed the lessons of the day. But it wasn't just about the ideas, it was about lived experience. The tavern was where people came to share that experience. They didn't just talk about abstract concepts, they talked about what mattered most to them. The struggles of the day, the personal victories, the everyday frustrations. The tavern allowed for these vulnerabilities to be shared in a space that could be both safe and unpredictable. Sometimes it was the place where you'd find your closest allies. Other times, it was where you'd encounter your most bitter rivals. But regardless of whether it was camaraderie or conflict, the tavern was where those feelings could be expressed and, in some cases, transformed. As you walk through the quiet streets, it's clear that the medieval tavern had a powerful hold on the imagination. It wasn't just a place, it was a state of mind. The stories, the laughter, the games, the debates, the silence in the early hours after the crowd had gone. These experiences shaped the very fabric of society, even as they gave individuals the chance to create something new for themselves. The tavern was where the personal and the collective merged in the most fascinating of ways. Every conversation, every drink shared was a part of a larger human narrative, and each visitor played their part. And now, as you reflect on your own journey through the tavern, you begin to see that it's not just the stories of those who lived centuries ago that live on in the tavern. It's the stories of all of us connected through time by this shared human experience. The tavern is, in many ways, a timeless institution. It is a place that allows us to both escape and embrace our own realities, to find solace and conflict, and to forge connections that transcend time. Though you've walked away from the tavern physically, it will remain within you, in the memories, the lessons, and the human truths it revealed. The tavern is not just part of history, it is a living memory, alive in the ways we gather today, in the ways we connect, share, and sometimes even fight. The legacy of the tavern lives on in the simple act of gathering, of sharing a drink, a story, or a moment of connection. As you continue on your way, the quiet streets echo with the sound of distant laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the whispers of stories that will continue to be told in taverns both old and new. The cycle continues, as it always has, as it always will,